Magnus Carlsen has dominated the scene of chess since he was a teenager. He rarely faces difficulty in the face of any opponent. That being said, here are some of Magnus's fastest wins so far in his career. Up first is his match against Lars Monsen, a famous explorer. Despite being well known as an explorer, he is also a formidable chess player. To make the match even more difficult, Magnus would only have 30 seconds, compared to Monsen's 3 minutes. Magnus opens with white pawn e4, Monsen responds quickly with pawn c5. This is called the Sicilian defense. Magnus moves his knight to f3, with Monsen moving his own to c6. This is followed by white pawn to d4. After a few pieces develop a bit more, Monsen advances his pawn to a6. This opens up Magnus to move in with his knight to d6. The intention behind this move is to cause a fork between Monsen's bishop and king. This leads to a trade which allows Magnus to bring his queen right to the front lines. Monsen brings his own queen out to e7, which causes Magnus to retreat his queen back to d1. Monsen follows this up with pawn h6. Magnus jumps his knight over to c3 with black knight f6 following right after. White bishop slides over to e3, which leads Monsen to castle. Magnus advances his pawn to g4. This causes Monsen to use a lot of his time, ultimately deciding on knight e8. On the attack, Magnus shifts his knight to d5. Monsen decides to move his queen forward to e6. White pawn moves ahead to g5, leading to a knight trade. This also allows Magnus to take a pawn. Monsen moves his pawn to g6 as white rook moves to g1. Black king goes to h7, white pawn goes to h5, black rook to g8, and now Magnus has captured yet another pawn. Monsen retaliates back, but this opens up white queen as it moves to d3. After a few more moves are played, Magnus captures the knight on f6. Monsen makes a horrible mistake as he moves his queen to f7. This allows Magnus to take his queen, which is a critical blow. It is at this point that Monsen starts to freak out, accidentally dropping the clock in the process. This scrambling marks the end of the match already, as his clock runs out of time moments later with Magnus promoting his pawn to a queen. The pair shake hands and Magnus is left smirking. The next game is against an impressive Grand Master, Sergei Karyakin. He has defeated many of the top players in his career, so this was undoubtedly assumed to be a hard-fought match. Magnus opens with white pawn e4. Karyakin matches him with pawn e5. White knight jumps over to f3 as black knight goes to c6. White bishop slides over to b5, with the other black knight shifting to f6. Magnus advances his pawn to d3, followed by black bishop c5. These moves turn into the Roy Lopez opening. After a trade, Magnus's knight jumps to d2. Karyakin responds by castling. Magnus uses a few seconds to think of his next move, which turns out to be castling as well. Karyakin's bishop shifts over to g4, with white pawn moving to h3. A few more moves are made until Magnus's bishop goes to g5. Black pawn applies pressure to the bishop by going to h6. The bishop retreats to h4, leading to Karyakin wasting some time pondering his next move. He decides to move his pawn to g5. This turns out to be a massive error. Magnus advances his pawn to g4 in order to attack the opposing bishop. Karyakin retreats with his bishop to g6. Magnus moves his own bishop to g3. This is the start of a massive series of moves consisting of Magnus advancing his pieces forward towards a vulnerable black king. Eventually, Magnus shifts his knight to f5. Karyakin moves his own to e6. This opens up Magnus to slide his rook over to h1. The rook has a wide open lane of attack all the way to the opposing king. Karyakin is in a very perilous position. With very few moves to make, he engages in a trade of knights and bishops. Not only that, but a pair of rooks are traded as well soon after. Magnus's queen is now in a great position to pressure Karyakin's king. Karyakin slides his rook over to h8, which causes Magnus to move his queen to g6. This creates a check, allowing him to move his knight to f6, taking a pawn in the process. This also allows Magnus to win a rook trade. A few more moves are made until Magnus delivers the finishing attack of pawn f6. Karyakin resigns after this due to an inevitable checkmate. The two shake hands as Magnus once again beats an impressive opponent quickly. The third game is against Fide Master, Espen Agdestein. Magnus has only 40 seconds to defeat his now former manager. Magnus opens with white pawn g3. Espen responds with pawn d5. This is known as the King's Fianchetto opening. Magnus's bishop moves to g2 with both sides moving pawns after this. Black knight jumps to f6, white knight to d2 and black pawn to e5. Magnus moves his pawn to the center with e4. Espen's bishop moves to e7, white knight to f3, black knight to d7 and both players castle. A pair of pawns are traded right after as Magnus moves his pawn to c4. He is essentially trying to bait Espen into taking the pawn. This makes Espen uncomfortable since he starts tapping the table. He decides to move his rook to e8. Magnus's knight moves over to f5 and black bishop goes to f8. White knight moves to e4, which lines both of Magnus's knights together. This formation has the potential to unleash a horrific attack. Despite this, black pawn advances to h6. Magnus swiftly brings his queen into the action with f3. Espen makes a big mistake when he takes the e4 knight with his f6 knight. This allows Magnus to take the knight with his rook, which sets it up for more mobility. After Espen moves his queen to b6, the now mobile rook goes to g4. Espen sends his king to the h8 corner. Magnus plays the aggressive move of knight to g7, which captures a pawn in the process. Black bishop takes the knight, and white queen takes a pawn on f7. Espen slides his rook over to g8, while Magnus moves his own to g6. Espen moves his knight to f6, white bishop slides across the board to capture on h6. This creates a trade which essentially forces a checkmate. Magnus only needed 18 seconds to defeat the FIDE master in dominating fashion. The final match takes place against one of the richest people alive, Bill Gates, the genius who co-founded Microsoft. Magnus will only have 30 seconds to defeat him. Gates opens with white pawn e4. Magnus responds with knight c6. Gates follows up his previous move with knight f3. Black pawn goes to d5, white bishop to d3, and then Magnus shifts his knight to f6. A trade of pawns occurs, and Magnus's queen is in an advantageous position. Gates sends his knight to c3 while Magnus moves his queen over to h5. Making the worst move possible at the moment, Gates decides to castle. Magnus takes advantage of this with bishop g4. Gates begins to play exactly as Magnus predicts, which allows him to very quickly take control of the game. After black knight to e5, he finishes off Gates with queen h2. Magnus has defeated Bill Gates in less than 10 moves, while using under 12 seconds on the clock. All of these games are reminders of Magnus's brilliance and domination when it comes to chess.